In 1998, two Stanford students were building a company inside a borrowed garage. 6 years later, that improvised project would enter the stock market. In August 2004, Google sold shares publicly at $85 each. The strange part was how little the beginning resembled this ending. There was no corporate tower, no global brand, and barely any money. There were just two young researchers obsessed with organizing the web. Their first breakthrough was not a company. It was a different way of ranking information. That idea would eventually decide what billions of people saw first. But at first, almost nobody knew their names. So why did these two outsiders build what established search companies missed? And what did building it ultimately cost them? The answer begins before Google existed at all. In 1995, Larry Page arrived at Stanford as a graduate student. He met Sergey Brin that same year, and the relationship began awkwardly. Sergey was already deeply comfortable moving between mathematics, computing, and intense debate. Larry was fascinated by machines, patterns, transportation, and the structure of information itself. Their shared curiosity soon focused on one enormous question: how could the web be organized? Their project began as research, not as a billion-dollar business plan. They called the early search system Backrub, because links mattered. Instead of treating every page as equal, they examined the web's connections. A link from one important page could signal value to another. That principle became PageRank, eventually named after Larry Page. Stanford's own history says the project became Google using dorm room computers. The experiment was becoming too large for student rooms. They were still students, but their infrastructure was already becoming industrial. The Stanford paper said their prototype already covered at least 24 million pages. The web was exploding, and their small system was trying to keep up. Then came the question neither algorithm could answer alone: should this become a company? Their first instinct was reportedly to license the technology instead. They approached established internet players, expecting someone to recognize the advantage. Recognition did not arrive immediately. David Filo of Yahoo recognized the technology but urged them to keep developing it. That advice changed the decision: if search mattered, perhaps they should build it themselves. They paused their doctoral plans and began searching for early funding. Their business plan was modest compared with the scale of what they were building. Then Andy Bechtolsheim saw a demonstration. Bechtolsheim was a Sun Microsystems co-founder, already experienced in building technology companies. He reportedly liked what he saw enough to write a $100,000 check. The check was made out before Google legally existed as a corporation. So the check sat in a desk drawer while paperwork caught up. Other early investors and supporters followed, giving the project room to breathe. Now they needed a name, an office, employees, and servers. They settled on Google, a playful name linked to a huge mathematical number. The URL google.com had already been registered in September 1997. On September 7, 1998, Google opened its doors in Menlo Park. Their first office was literally a friend's garage. The company began with only a tiny team inside that borrowed space. Craig Silverstein became Google's first employee, according to the company's early history. The garage had a washer, dryer, and even a hot tub nearby. It looked nothing like Silicon Valley's future headquarters. Yet the product was already answering thousands of searches every day. Users noticed something simple: the results felt better. Google looked almost embarrassingly plain beside cluttered portal websites. The restraint was part of the advantage. The company focused on relevance before spectacle. That sounds obvious now, because Google helped make it obvious. In 1999, Google moved from the garage into offices in Palo Alto. The company was growing faster than its original founders expected. Investors now had a different problem: the search engine actually worked. But building search at scale required servers, bandwidth, electricity, and relentless engineering. Every improvement created another infrastructure problem behind it. The search engine needed to crawl more pages without slowing down. And the team had to keep finding ways to make computers cheaper. Their advantage was software, but survival depended on hardware. Meanwhile, users kept returning because the results earned their trust. This was becoming a habit before it was becoming a monopoly of attention. Then Google confronted the question of how to make search sustainable. They had once criticized advertising-heavy search models, then reconsidered. The solution was less about louder advertising and more about relevance. Search became a bridge between information and commercial intent. That business model would become one of Google's defining transformations. By the end of the decade, Google's problem was no longer obscurity. Now the company had to survive its own growth. More employees meant more management, more servers, and more expensive mistakes. Page and Brin still wanted to protect the technical culture that got them started. But a startup's informal habits become harder to preserve at scale. So the next chapter required something the founders had never built before: an institution. Google hired Eric Schmidt as chief executive to help manage that transition. The founders remained deeply influential, but operational complexity had changed. The company now needed to prove that fast growth could become durable power. By 2002, Stanford reported nearly 400 employees and enormous search volume. Stanford also reported the company had been profitable for more than a year. The garage experiment had become a serious technology company. Then Wall Street entered the story. Google filed for an initial public offering in 2004. The offering was structured differently from a conventional Wall Street debut. Google's SEC filing records the eventual public price at $85 per share. The IPO closed in August, transforming private stakes into public wealth. 6 years earlier, they had been trying to move beyond dorm rooms. Now investors around the world could buy a piece of the experiment. The company's origin story had become part of its power. It proved that enormous infrastructure could begin inside an ordinary household. But scale introduces a darker question: who controls the gateway to information? A search engine does not merely find information. It orders visibility. And once people trust those rankings, changing them changes behavior. That power was almost invisible when Google was still living in a garage. Inside, the founders were still arguing about algorithms and servers. Their disagreements were technical, financial, and eventually philosophical. They wanted a company that could think long-term, not merely maximize the next quarter. That belief later shaped how Google's founders described public ownership. Their IPO letter emphasized long-term thinking and user-focused innovation. But no philosophy can remove the pressure created by becoming enormous. By now, Google had moved far beyond the original search problem. Search had become the foundation for an expanding information empire. It had become infrastructure for the modern internet. And that made the founders' original question much bigger. If you organize information, do you eventually gain power over it? And if you gain that power, how do you keep it from changing you? Those questions were not visible when the company was 3 people in a garage. They only needed their system to work tomorrow morning. That modest goal became an institution with global reach. The contrast is almost absurd: garage floor to global information infrastructure. Yet Google was never only a story about being smarter than competitors. It was a story about persistence after the obvious path stopped working. Licensing was safer. Building the company was riskier. They chose the risk. The next 6 years transformed that choice beyond recognition. The company that began with borrowed space now carried public expectations. That changed the founders too, even if the ambition remained recognizable. They had become leaders of an organization much larger than themselves. The early years had taught them something more valuable than a business model. They learned that persistence becomes an advantage when other people stop believing. But persistence alone does not explain Google. Timing mattered. Technology mattered. The founders' decisions mattered. Most importantly, they chose to build when selling seemed easier. That decision created consequences far beyond their original plan. By then, the garage was no longer the important part. What mattered was what they had decided inside it. They believed better information access could change how people understood the world. They also discovered that controlling access creates responsibility whether intended or not. That tension would follow Google long after the garage disappeared. The startup had become the establishment it once challenged. That is the irony of almost every successful disruption. The outsider becomes powerful enough to define the rules. Google began with people who could not know where the experiment would lead. They only knew the existing system was not good enough. Sometimes the biggest companies begin with one very specific dissatisfaction. For Page and Brin, that dissatisfaction was the chaos of the growing internet. They did not invent information. They built a new way to navigate it. And navigation became influence. That is why Google's story is bigger than technology. It is a story about what happens when convenience becomes dependence. The garage story inspires because its beginning was genuinely small. The empire story matters because the ending became unimaginably large. Somewhere between those extremes, a choice changed everything. They chose not to sell the idea. They chose to build the institution. The question now is whether success changes the mission that created it. Does building power to organize information eventually change who holds the power? Tell us in the comments where you think that line begins, and subscribe. Every episode, we break down how improbable empires were built from almost nothing.